How many of you remember that song? It was written back in 1963 by the Drifters. And then it was made really famous by George Benson back in 1978. The words of that song start off this way. It says, "They say the neon lights are bright on Broadway. They say there's always magic in the air. But when you're walking down that street and you ain't had enough to eat, the glitter rubs right off and you're nowhere." I thought about this song in relationship to a passage that we're going to study today in the scriptures. Because you see, what he's saying to us is on Broadway, life is filled with its shares of ups and downs, of successes and disappointments, of thrills and heartbreak. It's a mixed bag on Broadway. But the sobering truth is that the twists and turns that life often brings, there's always this temptation to find life's purpose on the Broadway, to pursue a life that promises more than it can deliver, to live out one's life in pursuit of something that will never truly satisfy. See, that's the allurement of Broadway, with its lights that glitter and the magic that's in the air. There is this allure of fame and fortune, and the attraction is enough to propel far too many on a very different kind of course. Life's altering decisions are made sometimes on this Broadway. You don't realize it at the time, but there's a lot of personal compromises that are made until one day it's a little too late. And you wake up to the reality of some unfulfilled dreams combined with some bitter disillusionment, and you suddenly find that your life, man, has gone in a direction that you never would have anticipated. The Broadway seemed to have so much promise. It seemed to be filled with so much excitement and adventure. And then time moves on, and you wonder what it is that you actually saw about that Broadway. In our scriptures, there's an Old Testament king by the name of Solomon who understood this in a really unique way. You see, Solomon knew all about this high life. In fact, it's recorded for you in the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. It recounts all of the various adventures that Solomon gave himself to, saying that he withheld nothing that his mind could imagine. He was one of the wealthiest men in the world at the time. And you know what he said when looking back on his life? He said it was all but a chasing after the wind. Such a life rarely leaves one satisfied. Such a life doesn't provide a hedge from life's deepest disappointments and trials. The high life, he learned the hard way, was not exempt from pride and envy that could erode the foundations of one's life, where jealousy and vain ambition can undermine friendships, families. When you live your life driven by your own passions, it could produce a tainted view of other people, as well as leave you with such a disappointment about your own present circumstance. Jesus was right when he said, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." The sad part is that you could live your life and then one day recognize that maybe I was chasing after the wrong thing. It's like that old cartoon where a guy, he has this ladder against the house and he climbs up to the top and he says, "I think I put my ladder on the wrong house." He thought he was climbing this ladder of success, and it produced something just the opposite. Jesus has been sharing with us some really deep truths in the Sermon on the Mount, a different strategy that he calls us to pursue. he calls us to start to think deeply on his word, to avoid what he calls this superficial life that's just being lived out for other men to see. He's really calling us to seek his kingdom and his righteousness. Jesus calls and offers us some clear direction. In this sermon, he comes close, and now these words, they're beginning to reach a conclusion, and you find the tone of the sermon is really begin to be very measured. And Jesus is now about to present a very clear choice to those who have been listening to him. It's either the Broadway or something more. He offers a path that leads to the kingdom of heaven, and that's the question I want to raise with you today. What path does lead to this kingdom of heaven? Jesus is about to disclose that in the text before us. If you want to follow along in the scriptures here, it starts at Matthew chapter 7. Jesus says this, he says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." You see, there are two ways that Jesus is about to define. Those disciples now who have been listening to him as he began to just unfold what it meant to be more and more a citizen of this kingdom of heaven, he begins to say, okay, all the things that I've said to you, now it boils down to this. There's a very clear choice that he is presenting. Two very defined paths. I put down here that Jesus offers us two contrasting options, and each one comes with a promise. Each one has its reward. However, they will lead us in some very different destinations. The wide gate. You can go back to that text for a moment. It's found in Matthew 7:13. He says, the wide gate, it leads to the broad way. Think about this for a moment. The wide gate leads to the broad way. It says, and many there be that enter it. The gate is wide, so it's accommodating. It fits all kinds of people. It fits all kinds of lifestyles and choices. There's no restrictions. The wide gate is broad enough for anybody to enter, just as you are, appealing to our own desire to live life on our own terms according to one's own truth. The only problem is the destination. The way is broad enough to accommodate whosoever, but it's headed towards destruction. That doesn't seem like a healthy option. On the other side, it says the small gate leads to this narrow road. And Jesus is purposeful. He's saying that the gate is small. It's restrictive. It's not as broad as the other gate. You can't come in burdened with all of your own trappings. It says it's restrictive. It's a small gate. And the way is narrow. It's very defined. But this life, he says, this road, it leads to life. Sometimes when I hear people talk about these two ways, they make the narrow road appear as less enticing than the first one. But it's only because I think of the lens in which we look at it. For instance, how many times have you heard people talk about those who take their faith a little more seriously, who are trying to really live out the intent of what Jesus says in his word, and they say, well, you guys are just too narrow-minded. You're not broad enough, right? You're just not well-versed enough to really appreciate all of life. But as I started off my sermon, the Broadway, it's filled with magic, man. The neon lights are bright on Broadway. But Jesus says all of that at the end is not going to bring a sense of satisfaction. Very often it robs people of life because it puts us on a pursuit of things that are temporal, not eternal. It puts an emphasis on the wrong syllable. And so consequently, we find ourselves engaged in this life, and sometimes it's not until you get a little bit older that you look back and you think, why did I waste so much time in such frivolous pursuits? What was it that was so alluring about this treasure? And then you realize that Jesus' narrow way was meant to help us to really begin to focus one's attentions and one's passions, to really help us to discern what was of real value. And the narrow road is defined by his word that begins to stretch us so that we recognize that the fruit that should come from this life is love and joy, peace and patience, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, kindness, self-control. That's the fruit that should come from a life that's being lived on this narrow way. Only very often, the narrow way is associated with people who are grumpy and they're not very joy-filled. In fact, they're on that narrow road, but they're not happy campers. They'd rather be on the Broadway, because that seems to be where the magic is. And then you realize, like, maybe it has more to do with the way in which we're perceiving these roads. Because what is so alluring about a road that is leading to destruction? It's just that we become deceived because we think, no, that's the most important. But when you get on this road with Jesus and you begin to live life as defined by his will and his purposes, you find yourself suddenly being liberated. Because now it's not just about you, it's about him. Now all of a sudden you recognize that what God is calling me to is to die to self so that he might live in me. And then we see the greatest sacrifices being made by people, examples of great generosity, of commitment and compassion in the world, because they're serving a higher purpose. It's only narrow if we have in mind the allurements that are just going to wind up leading us down a path of our own undoing. But there are these two paths, and Jesus is saying you're going to have to make a choice. It's not a maybe, it's where all this is headed. It's not enough to just intellectually now begin to think a little bit more about, well, what does God really mean? What is he really saying to us? Now it comes to a choice, and he's saying you got to choose today which road that you're going to travel on. One provides you with the reward of great company and unencumbered passage. Only it's not going anywhere. The other one is putting on this mantle of discipleship, finding yourself being conformed more and more into God's will, transformed by the renewing of your mind, proving what is good, acceptable, and perfect. And Jesus says you find life there, abundant life. So how are we to find this small gate? It's not hard to find ourselves confused sometimes in this life, meandering about in search of this gate. I wrote here, we need directions, but we must be discerning in who we ask. It could very well lead us into some very different roads. Poor directions have their consequences, don't they? You make a few wrong turns, you find yourself being lost. In our family, my brother-in-law has the enviable reputation for being the one who added 8 hours to an already very long trip. We were on our way down to South Carolina for one of our annual, family get-togethers. And after driving for a period of time, he stopped to get some gas. He was tired. He got the gas and something to munch on, and instead of going south, he went north, and he went all the way back up towards Ohio again. And when he finally found that what he was doing, he was already 4 hours into it. And now he had to turn around and go back. And driving that extra 4 hours was not the problem. The problem was all the girls in the car complaining about having to be in that car for an extra 8 hours. Since that time, we always questioned his navigational acuity. Somebody else is getting the directions. So how are we to find this road? You have to be careful about who you're asking. Look what it says in Matthew 7, verse 15. It says, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. I want you to think about this for a moment. Jesus now is telling you got to watch out. You got to be careful who you're asking. You're going to get different directions. The false prophet here, one of the things that you see here is he's rather deceptive, isn't he? There is this appearance that he's a sheep. He's part of this fold. But inwardly it says they're ravenous wolves. And what do wolves do? They hunt sheep. Wolves devour sheep. This is not a good place to be. And what's the revealing criteria about what's going on inside of them? He says, by their fruit, you will know them. Jesus goes on and elaborates on that a little bit more. He says this. He says, do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. So Jesus is saying to you and me, it's what they do. It's how they're living out their life. It's not just in their words alone. It's not that you have the Christian vocabulary. Their life has to reveal who they are. Jesus says you hang around people long enough, you find out whether it is they're really living their lives on the Broadway or they're living life by these kingdom priorities of the road defined by Jesus. It's not hard to see that, right? Come on, how many examples do we have, in just recent history of people who've made these great professions? And then you examine the fruit in their life and you're thinking, oh my gosh, something's not right here. Jesus is saying, if you're going to find the path that leads to the kingdom of heaven, you're going to have to be careful about who you ask. The false prophets, they'll deceive you. But Jesus continues his instruction now with a warning against these false prophets, because they're not just deceptive, they're also going to be proving to be very misleading. They not only appear as something they're not, but their words also prove to be false. Look what it says in the remainder of this passage. In verse 21, he says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. See, this is not just a vocabulary. It's not just about words that we memorize or verses that we can quote. It's about a life. Jesus says you can't fake the fruit. And as a result, he says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, is going to enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? In your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? For a long time I used to read those verses and I just took them at face value. When I read them, I thought, wow, these people are prophesying. These people are casting out demons. These people are performing miracles. And then I remembered something. I remember Jesus saying that Satan is the father of lies. He's the great deceiver, right? When Jesus was led out into the wilderness, where he was tempted by the devil, what, for 40 days and nights. Do you remember at one point when it says, after that period of time, it said that Jesus was hungry, and Satan comes along, and what does he do? He hits him at his most vulnerable part. Jesus had just finished, prior to those 40 days, he had been baptized by the Spirit of God, right? It says the Spirit of God descended upon him like a dove. The heavens opened up, and the Father said, "This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased." The attestation of God the Father was now heard by all those who were present. Everything that Matthew had been saying in chapters 1, 2, 3, 4 now comes to a culmination. And now you have this crowning affirmation of God that his Son, the one in whom he is well pleased, is perfectly positioned as the Messiah that had been promised since the beginning. And now the devil comes along and says, if you are the Son of God, what do you mean? The heavens just opened. The Spirit of God descended. God the Father opened his voice. But Satan's always putting that little seed of doubt in everyone's mind. He says, if you are the Son of Man, then why don't you turn these stones to bread? What does Jesus do? He says, it is written. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. You see how he answered Satan's little ploy was with an adherence to what God's revealed will is. He just quoted God's words back to him. But where I'm really going with this is he takes Jesus and brings him to this highest point. And he says that he shows him all the kingdoms of the world. And then he says to Jesus, if you bow down to me, all of these kingdoms I will give to you. And Jesus again says, it is written, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God and him alone. But I want you to think about what the devil promised. The devil was promising all these kingdoms of the world. Was that in the devil's priority to give them away? They weren't his to give. His power was limited. He could only do what God our Father has allowed him to do in this broken world that we're living in now. You've seen that with Job, for instance, right? When Job was afflicted, God was pretty clear that there's just so far you can go. See, so I go back to this passage that's before us now, and there are many people who are saying, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? In your name did we not cast out demons? Did we not perform many miracles? They're lying. You can't produce good fruit from a bad tree. That's what Jesus has been just saying to us. They may be saying that, and they may be acting in a way to deceive others into thinking that. But Jesus says a bad tree cannot produce good fruit, and a good tree can't produce bad fruit. So Jesus looks at them and says, what? I never knew you. Whose name were they doing these things in? Certainly not Jesus' name. Jesus himself is saying, I never knew you. Depart from me, you evildoers. Underscoring the fact that this is a bad tree that is producing bad fruit. They are false prophets who not only deceive, but are also in that deception, they're very misleading. They're given this impression of being this godly individual. They speak with such a spiritual sounding voice that if you're not careful, you could find yourself hitched up to the wrong wagon, and now you're living your life on this Broadway instead of living life on this narrow way. See, the danger with these false prophets is they talk a big game, but they can't walk the talk. Jesus had much to say about that, didn't he? So where are we with this? He says, you are asked then to commit to one of these ways. And you have to sit there and think about, where is the tenor of my life really leading? Can I break this down one more time for you? The right path is not the most popular path. That's what Jesus is saying. There's a large crowd that's living on the Broadway. There's a whole lot of people there. It seems like you get on this road, man, you're happy. Just live your life. Whatever goes, whatever makes you happy. Well, that's the way it seems. Until the further on down the road you go, you realize that you've made so many compromises that you kind of lose a little sight of who you are. Maybe to fit in with the crowd now, you've compromised yourself, your own understanding of this truth that God has given. And it's never too late to get off that Broadway. God talks about repentance, right? We can certainly exit. But how many scars do we have to build up? How much hurt? How much pain? See, that road is leading to destruction. The only thing is we get deceived because it's so crowded. We get distracted. And sometimes that distraction is very subtle. That's why these false prophets, they come and they look the part. They even talk the part. But when you compare the life with this life that Jesus is asking us, then you realize how very far away it is. It's very shallow. Remember when he talked about, acts of righteousness, not to be done, to be seen of men. But when you do them in secret, so your Father who sees in secret will reward you. It's doing right things, but you're doing it the wrong way and for the wrong reasons. It can be very subtle, very deceptive, very misleading. I read an article recently that I read this article and I just put it down and I thought, there's elements of truth in this article, but it's also pretty misleading. I just want to read an article that was written by a woman named Emma Goldberg in the New York Times. It was at the end of August of this past year, just, 6 months ago? She writes this article, and the name of the article was, Harvard's Chief Chaplain is an Atheist. She writes in this article, she says, the Puritan colonists who settled in New England in the 1630s had a nagging concern about the churches they were building. How could they ensure that the clergymen would be literate? Well, the answer was Harvard University, a school that was established to educate the ministry, and it adopted the motto, truth for Christ and the church. It was named after a pastor, John Harvard, and it would be more than 70 years before the school had a president who was not a clergyman. Nearly 4 centuries later, Harvard's organization of chaplains has elected as its next president an atheist by the name of Greg Epstein. Epstein, author of the book Good Without God, is a seemingly unusual choice for the role, as that he will coordinate the activities of more than 40 university chaplains who lead the Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, and other religious communities on campus. It's kind of like chaplains in the armed services. They have to provide services for a wide variety of faiths. And the truth of the matter is, living out our faith, we have to do it in a world that is filled with believers and unbelievers. Jesus never asked us to leave the world. We ought to go into this marketplace. We ought to go into the world, but always maintaining the savor, right, the salt, and always making sure that we're letting our light shine. Because you are the light of the world. You're the salt of the earth. You can't lose your saltiness. You can't hide the light. And you have to go into the world because we're this transformative process that God is going to use in this world around us. So I understand the diversity of people in this world, but this is where, for me, it just turned a little bit. Epstein said, there is a rising group of people who no longer identify with any religious tradition, but still experience a real need for conversation and support about what it means to be a good human and live an ethical life. So get this, he says, he has been Harvard's humanist chaplain since 2005, teaching students about the progressive movement that centers people's relationship with one another instead of with God. So in other words, you and I, there is this, in this article, right, the intent is to live this good, human, ethical life, and God doesn't have to be a part of it at all. He goes on in the article and says, this reflects a broader trend of young people across the United States who increasingly identify as spiritual, but religiously non-affiliated. That trend might be especially salient at Harvard. And quote, it says, a Harvard Crimson survey of the class of 2019 found that those students were 2 times more likely to identify as atheists or agnostic than 18-year-olds in the general population. So somehow or another, whatever kind of faith is in there, it's getting sucked right out of them. Epstein said, we don't look to a God for answers. We are each other's answers. Epstein's community has tapped into the growing desire for meaning without faith in God. A.J. Kumar, president of a Harvard Humanist graduate student group, said, being able to find values and rituals, but not having to believe in magic, that's a powerful thing. They're well-intentioned. And I would even agree that many representations of when people say we're Christian and then they act in a very unchristian way, it just brings disrepute upon all that Jesus is teaching us. But if you've been reading through the Sermon on the Mount, doesn't Jesus say that? He's telling you right now, you got to choose this path, and you got to follow those who are not false prophets, who are saying one thing and doing another. Because the Broadway, according to Jesus, is undesirable. It's not going to give you what you're looking for. So hence all this spiritual talk, all this openness to just, it's one thing to treat one another as you would want to be treated. That's what Jesus is teaching. He doesn't say just treat people who believe like me. In fact, Jesus went even further. He says you're supposed to love your enemies. So you want to be woke? Here's woke. Jesus says go that extra mile. Give that extra shirt. Take the cloak off your back. If you're really going to let your light shine in the midst of the darkness, then it's going to be as I lay hold of Jesus and take him seriously. But Jesus is telling you that to find the right path is going to require discernment. Now listen to what I'm going to say very carefully. You and I are not heart inspectors. You and I can't look inside another person and determine their heart. But Jesus just said, we are fruit inspectors. I may not be a heart inspector, but I am a fruit inspector. And this begins with those who claim to be on the right path. After all, what did Jesus say about your acts of righteousness? He says, don't do them to be seen by men. When you give to the needy, don't blow a trumpet and let everybody know, look how generous I am. He says, rather, when you give, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And he goes on to say, when you pray, don't stand up and pray these long prayers because you think you're going to be heard because of your many words. You want to garner a reputation for being spiritual just by playing the role. Jesus says, no, when you pray, I want you to go into your closet. I want your first thoughts to be about my Father who is in heaven. Hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done. And when you get centered on who he is and what his will is, now pray to him that he provides your daily bread, that he enables you to forgive others as he has forgiven you, so that we can seek first the kingdom of heaven. And didn't Jesus, by the way, also say that before you try to take the speck that's in your brother's eye, you should take the log out of your own? Because if you take the log out of your own eye, then you can see clearly enough to help your brother with the speck that's in his. So this idea then of living on the narrow road is Jesus' way of saying that you and I are dealing with our stuff first. That we want to give a healthy representation to the world around us of what it means to be Christian. That we don't have a reputation for being gossips, that we don't have a reputation for being judgmental, that we don't have a reputation for being cheap. Quite the contrary. We ought to love one another deeply from the heart. We ought to be the most empathizing people there are, even to those who don't believe like us. Because life is hard. Life on that Broadway, you and I already know, is not going to promise what people think it's going to promise. See, in all these above examples, Jesus reveals the duplicity of human nature, which is why he's come. Why am I going to trust in my own heart when Jesus says it's already tainted? That all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Jesus, in the following chapters, is going to add even more to this idea. But in the text before us, Jesus offers the direction that's needed to find the path to the kingdom of heaven. And what has he already told us? It's not found just in outward compliance. The path to the kingdom of heaven is not in talking a big spiritual game. The path to the kingdom of heaven is often going to be apart from this broad way that's only leading to destruction. Rather, the way is found, and Jesus said it plainly, by those who do the will of my Father who is in heaven. You want to know the way to the kingdom of heaven? It's defined by this narrow gate, this narrow road. That is illustrated by a person who takes God at his word and begins to live that out. How are you going to live that life without the empowerment of the Spirit of God in you? The Broadway is filled with all kinds of theologies about how you just can lift yourself up by your own bootstraps. Make better decisions and you'll be successful. Really. What ails humanity is something that you and I on our own will never fix. It's why Jesus came. It's why Jesus would say, in a way that many on the Broadway would find offensive, but it's true. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me. Now, we live in a world where many don't believe that. But it's your job, it's my job to manifest to the world what that looks like as they observe your behavior, so that by doing good, we would silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. That's what it says in 1 Peter. That we ought to let our light so shine before men that they see our good work and glorify our Father who is in heaven. See, the way to the kingdom of heaven is found by those who do the will of the Father. To disregard his word, to disregard his Son, is to do so at our own peril. After all, doing the will of the Father is what it means to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. Next week, you get to look at a passage that speaks about a wise builder and a foolish builder. It's all about what this life on the narrow way looks like. I want you to think what that rock means when Jesus says the wise man is the one who builds his house on the rock. I'll give you a little heads up. It's not Jesus. And it's not the Word of God. You go back and read verses 24 through 27 and see if you can figure out the answer for yourself. But that path, you're only going to find it by doing the will of the Father who's in heaven. Now perhaps you can understand why Jesus is so adamant about choosing the right way. Let's pray. Father, I want to thank you for these scriptures that just challenge us. When we read them, it flies in the face of so much of what is taking place around us. It only underscores the reality that broad is the way and wide is the gate. And many there be that find it. But Lord, as we engage this life that you have called us to, we become that light that shines in the midst of darkness. And sometimes, Lord, it attracts a whole lot of flies. But more times than not, it is illumining the way for people who are stumbling in the dark. May we be those kinds of people, quick to listen, slow to anger. May we demonstrate a love that is deeply rooted in a relationship that we have with you, so that people see this transformation in our life, that we become that fragrant aroma. Help us to walk a little more circumspectly. And as always, we'll be careful to give you all the praise in Jesus' name. Amen.